Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our brand new study in Phenomenology and the Theological Turn, a collection of essays first published in Paris in 1991. This is the English translation published by Fordham University Press in 2000. It's a collection of essays that addresses the theological turn in French phenomenology. But we've had enough background in phenomenology, so we're ready for this now. So we're going to take a look at it. We're going to begin with Janicaud and his essay on the theological turn. We're going to look at pages 16 to 35 to get us started. Basically, we're going to have an introduction to Husserl and to Heidegger to kind of get us looking at the history of philosophy in France and how it has taken up phenomenology. Let's begin with block one. And we're going to begin with the triune core. Janicaud took up a review of French philosophy from 1975 to 1990, which is not easily schematized, he says, but a coherence did initially show up in three persons of Levinus, Procure, and Henry. And it was not simply a transition from atheist phenomenology to spiritual phenomenology, but it did evolve out of Husserl and then Heidegger. It did evolve out of a response to Husserl and then to Heidegger. So, if you look at note 2, the phenomenology as a rupturing turn, this emerging core of the three addressed the aspects of the turn as addressing the invisibility of the real in sensate reality, addressing the other, and addressing the givenness of phenomena, and arca revelation. But Janicaud asked what conditions made this turn to phenomenology possible. It began as a response to Husserl and taking up the concept of intentionality and emerging as a movement against idealism. Basically, the French took up a rereading of German 19th century idealism, a rereading of Hegel, and then a rereading of Husserl, a rereading of Heidegger, the three big phenomenology philosophers, Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger. So began as anti-idealism in note 3. Sartre began by opposing the grossly sensate and distinguishing the real of perception as intentionality. Consciousness is abstracted from intentional correlation to the real in existence. So Janicaud asked, how does the eidos idea as description become concrete? And the answer is posited that the dynamic of affections is to supply this role, a dynamic of the human affections that are seated in human consciousness. So if we take a look at block 1, note 4, we'll look at the dynamic of the affections and the eidos idea. The being of intentional phenomena is not thing-like, but its transcendence must be preserved. But in France, that meant without idealism. The constituted object of inquiry is supposed to do this. They take up Heidegger's concept of pre-ontological understanding. So philosophy in France began as a rereading of 19th century idealism in Germany, a rereading of the Big Three, but it is specifically looking at Husserl and Heidegger. They became the rereading that was most important. So if we look at Note 5, we'll look at Heidegger's pre-ontological understanding. And it consisted of the self-consciousness possessing the sui generis categories as modes of self-consciousness, as the modalities of self-consciousness. And that consisted of a prior correlation between our transcendence and the sensate world. Ego evolves as Sartre's being of the world. So self-consciousness comes to play a very significant role. A very significant role. And epoche reduction is posited. So if we take a look at the epoche reduction in Note 6, this turn was next picked up by Merleau-Ponty, and the return to things in themselves. The eidos ideas are to be resituated in essences which are in existence. So positing being in the world and intersubjectivity is posited. There's a challenge to Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. There is a challenge there that begins to emerge. So let's take a look at Note 7 and take a look at how this movement in France continued. So Note 7, being in the world and intersubjectivity, two strong positions evolved out of this response to Husserl. Sartre's psychology of imagination and Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception. These two strengthened research in phenomenology in France, but it was attacked by the Marxists in spite of this new emergence. So under research and criticism, Levinas and Ricoeur emerge. Ricoeur's book, Oneself as Another, asking when does subjectivity become intersubjectivity? And Janicaud tells us that the question remains of how do we address this paradox revelation of transcendence from the perspective of phenomenology. How is this possible? That question still remains. The paradoxical revelation of transcendence within phenomenology. So we take a look at that in Note 9. How do we understand the relationship between phenomenology and metaphysics? How do we understand this relationship? Merleau-Ponty introduced the concept of intertwining, meaning horizon, that exists as a latency of the flesh of things. The visible palpitates with invisibility, with the invisible real. The sensate is imminently indwelt with a latency toward invisible reality, the real. And so, if we take a look at this Block 1, Note 10, we'll take a look at sensate visibility and the invisibility of the real. It is a horizon that is inscribed in corporality, says French philosophy, as an overflowing of the visible and an overflowing of the self's vision. There's self-consciousness again. Flesh becomes an element of being itself. Self-consciousness is immediately intersubjective. Intersubjectivity is inseparable from the texture of the world. So self-consciousness and intersubjectivity come to play a significant role in French phenomenology through the rereading of Husserl. But then there's a transition, says Janicaud, to the rereading of Heidegger, because Heidegger is going to offer that answer as to where do we find transcendence within phenomenology. Where do we find the notion of transcendence? How can we speak in a concrete way of the notion of transcendence? This is when French philosophy takes up the rereading of Heidegger. So block 1 was all about Husserl. Now we're going to take a look at block 2. We're going to take a look at the Heidegger and this possibility for transcendence. So in block 2, Heidegger posited the phenomenology of the unapparent. Thought becomes affirmation of transcendence through the interrogation of the visible and the elucidation of the hidden. We become open to the depth of the world. It's almost a faith-based point of view. So if we look at this depth of the world, we posit the desire of the absolutely other as the alterity of the other, which dwells in self-consciousness. Levinas enjoins this notion with his play of lights. So if we look at Levinas and the play of lights, there's the positing of the confidence of the other. That's at the very heart of experience. At the very heart of experience. Acquired through formal logic. And here, Janicaud says, the theological swerve begins to emerge. Through Levinas, the theological swerve begins to emerge. I should say, Levinas rereading Heidegger. So, let's take a look at Heidegger's notion of the phenomenology of the unapparent in Block 2, Note 4. It evolved from Heidegger of 1973. Husserl posited being as the objective given. Heidegger posited being as the unconcealing of presence. More of a personalism because it's dealing with self-consciousness. The unconcealing of presence. Consciousness becomes the seat of the ecstatic moment of being. The self gathers the emergence of the presence. Gathers this presence of the real at the depth of sensate experience. So if we look at this emergence of presence, it is acquired through tautological thought. Heidegger's tautological thought does not equal Husserl's constituted object in forming subjective correlates to ontological reality. They are not the same thing. There is a difference. So if we look at the notion of the subjective correlates that form in self-consciousness that are correlated with the objectively real that is given in the givenness of phenomena. We learn from Janicaud that in France the theological turn intersects positive phenomenology project, but also this quest for the possibility toward originality. There's an intersection, and at that intersection is where the theological turn emerges in France. There is a positive phenomenology project in the rereading of Husserl and the rereading of Heidegger, but there's this quest for transcendence and for originality as well. Can the phenomenology of the unapparent bridge those two concerns? That's the question. Leading to a return to the originary, by taking the unapparent as promise. So let's take a look at note 7, the unapparent as promise, Heidegger's unapparent as promise, which involves a tracing of a new approach to the sacred. Heidegger's turn was conditioned by his quest for the sacred. By reinterpreting Hölderlin, Heidegger's swerve of turn is the foundation of the theological turn in France. So his Phenomenology of the Apparent is a very significant rereading that led to the theological turn, says Janicaud. So if we take a look at this in note 8, the French created sequels to Heidegger's Phenomenology of the Unapparent. Marion posited pure form of the call. Cretin posited Phenomenology of promise. Henri posited revelation as affectivity. So if we take a look at this revelation as affectivity, it's an interiority of auto-affection. It's the foundation of immanence. Affectivity reveals the absolute. It's a unity between phenomenal manifestation and the real basis of life. And out of this develops an entirely reoriented phenomenology in France. Janicaud, remember, he said, very difficult. Of course, you're going to have oversimplifications when you develop a summary schema like this. So we can't be overcritical here of what Janicaud has done. He's trying to draw a picture of what happened in the rereading of German 19th century idealism in France by rereading Hegel, rereading Husserl, and rereading Heidegger, and specifically Husserl and Heidegger. So if you look at the bottom of the chart, I've got two summary timelines. We've got 3 and we've got 3b. 3 is going to be a summary of block 1. 3b is going to be a summary of block 2. So you've got 3 as a beginning with Husserl, a rereading of Husserl, and then that rereading was mediated through Levinas, then taken up by Ricoeur, Henri, and Sartre, who all took up this concept of the intentionality of the phenomena, and coupled with that, the sui generis categories of self-consciousness, which developed that concept of the latency of the flesh, a inner latency moving toward actuality. And then from there, we were led to the notions of the invisibility and the intersubjectivity, which is the grasping for the notion of transcendence within the maintaining of a phenomenology perspective. How was France going to do that? Well, they were going to do that by rereading Heidegger. And so after that first timeline, and 3, we go to 3b, we look at the timeline of rereading Heidegger. He posited the phenomenology of the unapparent. Levinas took this up. Again, things were mediated through Levinas initially. That became the theological swerve. Not yet a fully articulated theological turn, but the beginning. And French philosophy entered into that unconcealing of presence as that ecstatic moment of self-consciousness, acquired through tautological thought and the development of the subjective correlates that would correlate with the real, which is immanent as a latency in sensate reality. That meant that French philosophy took a return to originary content within phenomenology, and they wrote their own articulated sequels to Heidegger. They posited their own sequel rereadings of Heidegger's Phenomenology of the Unapparent in order to take up phenomenology, but to create a theological turn. Not the swerve, but an articulated theological turn. So it becomes a very good launching lesson. It's just a beginning for us, but it gives us, from Janicaud, we get a look at how in France this movement toward phenomenology began by rereading Hegel and Husserl and Heidegger, specifically Husserl, and then from there working their way to the point where they did address transcendence as invisibility and intersubjectivity, and then wanting to give concrete content to that, they took up a rereading of Heidegger, and this eventually led to rereading and rewriting the phenomenology of the unapparent. It's going to wrap up our first lesson in phenomenology and the theological turn, and we'll pick up next time on page 36.